Welcome to Season 6 of the Photo Ethics Podcast. I'm your host, Savannah Dodd, and I'm the founder of the Photography Ethics Center. Each week, I'll be talking with an accomplished photographer about the ethics of their practice. This episode of the Photo Ethics Podcast is brought to you by Falmouth University, one of the UK's leading creative arts institutions. If you're a regular listener, you'll know that I'm passionate about education, especially education that is accessible. With flexible online learning through Falmouth University, you can study from anywhere, starting in January, May, or September. Join the university that has nurtured the award-winning photographers Justin Carey, who we interviewed in Season 1, and Rehab El-Dalil, who we interviewed in Season 4. Falmouth graduates have been featured in the New York Times, The Guardian, and the BBC. If you're passionate about photography and want to refine your practice, Falmouth's specialist photography courses are designed for you. Led by expert academics and industry-savvy tutors, you'll develop your critical thinking and create work that explores powerful themes on a local, national, and international scale. Search Photography at Falmouth to find out more. Today, in episode number 3, we'll be talking with Lauren Walsh about conflict photography. Dr. Lauren Walsh is a professor at New York University, where she's the founding director of the Gallatin Photojournalism Intensive. She's also director of Lost Rolls America, a national archive of photography and memory, and in 2023 was named a Fulbright Specialist in Photography and Ethics. Lauren is a leading expert in conflict photography and peace journalism. She has headed up the first ever nationwide survey on journalism and mental health in a wartime setting, examining the real-time psychological challenges of media workers in Ukraine. Lauren's newest book is Through the Lens: The Pandemic and Black Lives Matter. Her other books include Conversations on Conflict Photography and Shadow of Memory. She's co-editor of The Future of Text and Image and the Millennium Villages Project, and editor of Macondo, Memories of the Colombian Conflict. She's published widely in national and international media, appearing as an expert on Al Jazeera, CNN, and BBC. So could we just start with you telling us a little bit about the kind of work that you do?
I wear a few hats, I would say, or maybe a different metaphor is I have a foot in one industry and a foot in the other. So on one side, I'm an academic and a professor, the founding director of the NYU Gallatin Photojournalism Intensive. And under that academic hat, I am also a scholar and a researcher who publishes. This other foot that I have that is planted in the industry pulls me inside journalism with most affiliations in photojournalism. So I'm an expert in the visual journalistic coverage of conflict and crisis. And through that work, I became kind of a photo editor with many photographers working on projects. I have also become an advisor who talks to them about ethical practice. And over the years of working with photographers who are based in hostile environments, I became very aware of safety concerns and started advocating for greater safety awareness and safety training. And my particular point of specialty and intervention in that space is under the heading of mental health and journalism. So I have been working on a number of publications and projects under that broad heading. That's the kind of broad landscape where I seem to run around inside.
Absolutely. And I guess it's really interesting to speak with you because a lot of times, I think most of our episodes sort of focus on interviews with photographers, but I really like to get sort of other perspectives from across the industry into conversation about this topic of ethics. And so I guess I wonder, could you maybe talk a little bit more about like career trajectory, like what your background is and how you got to where you are now?
It's not a typical trajectory for photojournalism. So I have a PhD in comparative literature, where I did doctoral work on novels that incorporate photojournalistic images of historical traumas, right? So the interest in the visual has always been there. With a PhD in literature, there's little else you can do except stay inside academia. But I like academia, so that was fine. So I finished my PhD and got a job as a professor. But while I was in grad school, I was also working with a number of photojournalists. I kept getting recommended to be a photo editor, not on small projects, but as they were assembling books. And probably the connection is my deep interest in storytelling, whether it's literature or journalism. And I wound up being very good at this job of being a photo editor on book length projects. And it happened probably not randomly. I mean, I was already doing doctoral work on major world historical traumas like wars and other such situations. It was the case that the photographers I was working with had all been documenting in spaces of conflict. It was the beginning of a transition into storytelling and photos and conflict through the lens of journalism as opposed to novels, which I had kind of been enrolled in a program to do. And I finished my PhD and continued doing that photo editor work. And within a year of teaching as a professor, realized that I wanted to be placed within journalism and part of contemporary world historical events. I happened to be at a school where that transition was extremely easy to move from literature into saying photojournalism is what holds my interest and what I feel really strongly about. And regardless of the exact genre or the exact modality, the interest in ethics for me has always been there, always asking questions. The stakes, I don't want to say they're higher per se. I still have a deep love for novels, but novels, you're frequently in a fictional space, and journalism, you're not. The ramifications for the events that are being documented seem really high, particularly if you're specializing in crisis. And the ramifications for ethical rights and especially ethical wrongs seem really high because all of a sudden you're talking about real people in real situations, often in cases where they have been disempowered or violated in some capacity or displaced or lost agency or lost family or lost whatever it is. I think ethics matter broadly, but I kind of take it very seriously in my work. So that trajectory from graduate school and always an interest in photography, but this kind of movement into journalism around that point in time. I had a background a bit in journalism prior to that, but I had never really been the photo editor before and really, really liked it and thought it was maybe in some regards, a little bit of an unsung role, right? As you were saying, like typically the conversations you have are with photographers, and rightfully so, we pay a lot of attention to the photographer. And I think also there's this kind of person who sits behind that in many organizations or in many capacities who also plays a role in shaping the stories and a role that can have impact on how the story is communicated, what ethical decisions are made, and then how it reaches the public.
Absolutely. And I guess it's also quite an interesting difference of roles as well, thinking about the fact, I don't know if this is necessarily the case in your work, but that a lot of photo editors would be more in-house within organizations, whereas photojournalists are often freelance. So then that also offers maybe a slightly different set of considerations or a different approach or a very different role in that way.
I think that's correct. I mean, and of course, I'm not in-house anywhere as a photo editor. So I think the capital P, capital E photo editor is more often housed inside a news outlet or agency or publication. And I wouldn't say that I am first and foremost a photo editor, but I do photo editing. And I think there are a number of people like me who are outside of a specific organization or publication, but do photo editing.
Yeah, no, absolutely. That makes sense. I was listening to a video on your website, and I'm trying to remember which one it was, and I can't, so maybe you can remember. But you were talking a little bit about how a lot of academic literature has traditionally been quite hostile toward photojournalism, and I was wondering if you could speak to that a little bit. I mean, it reminds me of, I think it was the introduction to Susie Linfield's book, Cruel Radiance, where I believe she says something like a lot of photo scholars seem to hate photography. And I thought that was quite an interesting sort of setup to her book. So yeah, I don't know. I was wondering if you wanted to speak to that a little bit.
I have found that a lot of the academic critical literature about photojournalism is often hostile. Yeah, I guess to use, I don't remember the quote from Susie Linfield, but if that's her word, In part because I think the scholar is often charged with occupying the role of critiquing, right? Like we critique and in critiquing try to lead to new forms of knowledge. And that's fine. I have no problem with critique or criticism. What I was finding that felt quite problematic to me was there was this distance between academia and the practice of journalism. And what I was seeing was that a lot of times the criticisms or critiques didn't map to the reality of on the ground photojournalistic practice. So, it's one thing to kind of level charges at a photographer if they or their industry has done something wrong, but it's another if you're leveling charges that kind of exist in a vacuum because it's not how the industry works, or even just not taking into consideration. I think there are many, let's say, images from spaces of war or spaces of extreme suffering that do open themselves, at least initially, quite easily up to judgment, right? Like, how could you possibly have taken that picture? Or what were you thinking about here? And I think in many cases, it's easier to sit in your office and write a criticism of a frozen moment in time that never moves. You can look at it and really deeply ponder and write critiques, and they can be helpful, but they have to acknowledge the reality of how quickly a moment where bullets are flying might unfold, right? And how little time a photographer has to make decisions about pictures or about saving their own life or about saving someone else's life. So that was, I'm sure, what I was talking about, that I just felt that there was a misunderstanding and often in a kind of critical and condescending capacity coming from academics toward journalists. I can even pinpoint the moment where I started thinking about that more specifically. And it was before I wrote my book, Conversations on Conflict Photography, but the book is born from a moment that occurs in one of my classes where a student says something that is kind of provocative and shocking. Then that whole episode is spelled out in the beginning of my book. But essentially, it made me think about, wow, what would lead a student to say something like this? And essentially, like, we're looking at an image of extreme suffering, and the student says something that, at least at first blush, feels really apathetic towards the person who is suffering extremely. And I wanted to kind of, just being the scholar part of me, sort of went towards the library and was like, what else has been written on this? What can I find? And I was finding plenty of texts, a few books, a little bit more in terms of journal articles written by academics thinking about, the role of the war photograph or apathy or compassion fatigue. But what I kept finding again and again was that so many of these pieces of literature, particularly the ones by academics, were making these suppositions about journalism that, in my own experience working alongside photojournalists, they were wrong. Like, this isn't how it works. This isn't what it's like on the ground, or this isn't how images are filed, or this isn't the decision-making power, or this isn't the captioning system. Like, there were just lots of errors that I was seeing. So that was part of the reason for doing the book on conflict photography, was to say, or kind of have a book that spans this academic and journalistic space and tries to both offer the critiques and the criticisms and make space for understanding how journalism is practiced.
I think that's really interesting and really important as well, because absolutely, like, sort of that bridging of disciplines. And I think so often I see this across academia in general, like the siloing of different disciplines. And I think, there is a lot of speaking to the same themes, but sort of never the two sides sort of come together, the two perspectives come together to interrogate that collectively, which I think would probably lead to a lot more useful knowledge generation. That's definitely a really worthy goal. I guess I wonder, in terms of, the conversations that you have had with photojournalists, like in the making of that book, perhaps, what are some of the most prominent or the most complicated ethical dilemmas that sort of have recurred in those conversations?
There's one that it kind of has continued to confound me. And I'm grateful to the photographer for sharing her experience. To sort of give the story, she's documenting survivors of rape. And this goes back to the Bosnian War. So we're in the first half of the 1990s. And she's motivated by the fact that she's heard that this is ongoing, and rape definitively was a tool of warfare in that war. And she felt that international media wasn't really giving enough attention to primarily it was women who were getting raped. So to the women's stories and the women's experiences. And so she gets an assignment to go, and she's in Bosnia and surrounding areas, sort of refugee camps. And she seems to handle it. And this is, of course, early 1990s, like conversations about informed consent are not happening at that point. And yet she seems to handle it exactly as you would want someone to handle it, right? And she's like, I would never immediately take out my camera. I would never put anyone on the spot. I didn't go up to anyone to say, like, hey, are you a survivor of rape? And she would sort of let women open up and talk to her if they wanted to. And then she would say, I am working on a project or on an assignment. I do want to document these stories. Do you want to be part of this? And then it was even kind of giving them kind of collaborative creative license over the image too. Like, do you want your face shown or not? And I thought it was so much forethought, right? In terms of how I would now 110% recommend that somebody handle documentation like this. There are women who do say, I want this on record. I want this known. And there's one woman that she documents who elects to have her story shared and a photograph taken with her face showing. And so that's that, right? And then roll forward however many years, and she gets a message from that woman years later. And that woman says, I just came across my photo and I'm on a blog. And it had something to do with the war, though not specifically about kind of survivors of rape. But she gets identified on this blog as a rape survivor and doesn't want to be known that way. So the photographer describes this excruciatingly kind of methodical process of doing everything she can to get the photograph removed, right? So she removes it from her own archive, she removes it from her agency's archive, and she repeatedly tries to reach the person running the blog to have them take it down. She, I believe, never succeeds in that. The real kind of twist in this story, which was the part that kind of continues to confound me, is that in the early 1990s, what she was doing was documenting on film, like analog film. And at the time where the image was published, as I understand, was not in Bosnia, right? And so this woman said, yeah, you can tell my story, I want to be known. And then we go through a digital transformation and someone can take what was printed on paper and digitize it and give it an entirely different life. And from 2025, we of course understand this and we take extra precautions in a digital space. But in 1994 or wherever it was that this photographer was working, how in the world could she ever have known the technological changes that were going to come in the future? And that's a kind of ethical concern that I don't know how you anticipate what doesn't exist yet, but what might harm someone in the future. And at the same time, it's something that I think about a lot because I want to kind of anticipate what could happen. That wasn't necessarily kind of a repeated theme that I came across, but it was just such a, I think confounding is the word to me, right? Like you're unable to predict the future, particularly kind of inventions in the future. And yet it's that very thing that kind of wound up hurting this survivor who was pictured in an image when the photographer never, ever, ever intended to harm her.
Yeah, I think it's such a complicated situation. And it reminds me of some of the research that I've done as well. So my doctoral research was on photography of the Troubles in Northern Ireland. And, it was a similar thing. Those photographs were produced largely in 70s and 80s, I guess, and 90s, but at a time before, that future was anticipated. So that is definitely such a complicated situation. And I guess it makes me wonder about, I think a lot of times when you look at consent forms now, the consent form thing is kind of tricky because I think that sometimes, I wonder when reading a consent form, who is it structured to protect? The person who's signing the form or the organization seeking consent or individual seeking consent. But it makes me think about sort of this like blanket use of an image in perpetuity in sort of all of these various formats and unforeseen formats. And I guess how would you approach that or advise photographers about the use of that kind of clause in a form?
I would say it's not standard to use a form like that for photojournalism. And if you think about it in a practical sense, in any kind of a breaking news situation, there is no time to have forms signed. I think people who are working on longer form stories are maybe using forms like that. And I think it would be I guess it would be a situation by situation analysis. Yeah, it's hard for me to make a blanket rule about it. I have seen forms that are certainly designed to protect the photographer or the publishing organization, right? Almost like a legal protection, like you gave us the right, we have the right. I've definitely also seen forms that exist to protect the individuals who are having their stories told, including, there's an organization that I have done some consulting with called Artworks Project. They're more in a documentary film space, although have asked me to kind of consult with them in terms of visual journalism and photojournalism. And they have advocated strongly for a level of informed consent that necessarily provides the ability for a subject to back out at any point, even if it means like I'm entirely done with the project. I, the creator, am done with the project. If the subject says, I'm now afraid I might come to harm. So I think you can get a whole spectrum, and I wouldn't want a one size fits all form, because I think depending on what's being documented, it can radically shift what you need to protect for. But I guess at a baseline, I would always want documentarians to at minimum be thinking about all of this. And if it is a setting where you think somebody could be at risk because of your work, I do think it is fair to think it through very, very deeply and potentially offer them the opportunity to talk to you about it.
I guess thinking back to maybe the conversation about maybe the disconnect or the misunderstanding of photojournalism among academics, or maybe even among the general public, I wonder if there is a common myth about photography that you would want to debunk.
Yeah, I think there are misunderstandings just broadly speaking, as you're saying. And one of the things that I hear, even in my classes from students, they walk in and they are great, wonderful, idealistic humans who want the world to be a fairer, more just place. And sometimes that means, they'll take my classes because they know they're going to be about photo and ethics. And they have what I would call a kind of blame the messenger mentality sometimes, right? And so images that are extremely distressing because they show you pictures. Often it's like someone else's suffering, right? Or the violation that has been committed against someone else. And rightly so, these pictures are very emotional and they make us upset or angry. But what I notice often is that my students process that emotional reaction by taking it out on the photographer, right? Like, how dare the photographer take that picture? Like, how dare they take a picture of somebody in their most vulnerable moment? Or how dare they make money by selling that picture to a newspaper? That's someone's life. How dare they profit from it? And I try to unpack that. I have students who sometimes think that photojournalists make enormous amounts of money. And I don't know a single photojournalist who makes enormous amounts of money. So it's not like a lucrative profession. But what I do understand how uncomfortable it is to say, but that person is making any money off of someone else's hardship. And that's true, right? It is, a photojournalist should be paid for their work because it is a job. And if they are documenting someone else's hardship, it brings those two uncomfortable realities together. But what I try to remind my students, or what I would remind the general public, is like, this is a vital job. If we don't pay into it, then we lose what photojournalism or journalism broadly contributes to society, which is keeping an eye on what is happening around the world, particularly where we can't be, exposing injustices, making us aware. And once we are made aware, we can go and clamor for change. And so I think the gut reaction to get so upset with a photographer for showing you something so distressing, I get it. And at the same time, I want to say to my students, like, harness that anger and take it towards the perpetrators, or take it towards the leadership who can hold the perpetrators accountable.
Absolutely. And I guess it makes me want to ask as well about like the ethics of viewing photographs that are quite graphic or traumatic. And I think ethical viewership is something that maybe we don't talk about as much, but I think it's really worth considering as well. Could you speak to that?
I'm not even 100% sure what the phrase ethical viewership means, which probably makes your point, right? That we don't discuss it enough, that it's like a common language, and potentially it should be. I guess when I hear kind of ethics of viewing, things that come to mind to me are, once you have seen someone else's suffering, do you have a responsibility to do something in response? And, I can think of theorists who say yes, and I can think of others who say no, it's as unfair as blaming the messenger. I certainly think we live in a moment, and especially my students, who knows what's going on with TikTok, banned, not banned, but TikTok or Instagram or YouTube, they are the kind of primary sources for their information. And they are spaces that allow you to scroll really quickly, which to me, I'm not a native, digital native TikTok, digital native Instagram. To me, it feels very uncomfortable to think I might scroll really fast past suffering. And then at the same time, I don't know, is my phone the right space to look at this? What am I going to do if I pause on every single image of suffering? I'd never put my phone down. I mean, I think for me, the ethics of viewing, I guess, just raises a whole lot of kind of questions for discussion. And I think maybe that goes back to your point, right? It's not something that we tend to have robust conversations about. And maybe if there were just more conversations about it, there'd be a greater level of understanding of so what does it mean to look at enormous humanitarian disasters through TikTok on my phone for 3 seconds at a glance?
Yeah, I mean, it reminds me of something as well. I don't know if you read Jenny Odell's book, How to Do Nothing, but in it she talks about...
it has been recommended to me.
It's great. It's a great book. Yeah. But one of the things that she talks about is sort of the disjointed nature of, the content that's coming through our feeds, right? And how it makes it very hard to engage with. And I think that's something that I've really felt being involved in the photography industry, but again, also in my academic research on Troubles photography, because if you follow any of the archives of Troubles photography, then they get added into your feed. Like I have a black lab and I get a lot of black lab video content, and then it's interspersed with a graphic photograph from the Troubles. And I think it can be very disorienting. It's something really that I've been doing a lot of thinking about in how I use social media myself.
Yeah, I mean, and the thing I would add to that I hear from my students is sort of, there's what you're saying, the kind of disjointed black lab and then the Troubles, which makes it harder to engage. And then at the same time, the students who take my classes where we will spend, 4 weeks engaged on a single topic, I also hear from them, as they kind of become more alert to these ethical questions and more struggling with the kinds of topics that we're struggling with right now, they also at times run the risk of getting extremely overwhelmed. Like as soon as they start to think about how much injustice there is and actually how much access there is to imagery, if you use social media in certain ways, then I have also heard from them a sense of I'm just going to shut down. I can't solve all of this. What do I do? And that's something that, at least as a teacher of undergraduates, I actually really spend a lot of time focusing on that and acknowledging that they can't be aware of everything and they can't solve everything. And that's just the way the world works. And to try to put unreasonable burdens on themselves is going to lead to really bad feelings.
Something that you mentioned also at the start of our conversation was about your interest in safety and in particular the mental health of photojournalists. And I was wondering if you could maybe speak to that a little bit and maybe discuss some of the ways that maybe for the listeners who are pursuing a career in photojournalism, what can they do to think more carefully about their own safety and their mental health?
I'm happy to talk about that. So yeah, the slight background on that is, I've been specializing in conflict, crisis for a really long time. And initially my interest was not in safety, not that I'm anti-safety, but that just wasn't my trajectory. But even when I was doing the Conversations on Conflict photography book, which has a number of interviews with photographers who document crisis or humanitarian disaster or conflict around the world, and a number of interviews with photo editors who oversee that work, I didn't set out thinking it was going to be a book that dealt with anything about emotional consequences at all. And the more I did those interviews, the more I realized this is actually a through line. And I'm hearing it a lot. And then in my spaces of work as an advisor, right, whether it's photo editing or ethics, I was also hearing it a lot. Or not even just hearing it, I was noticing patterns that were becoming evident to me because I was kind of seeing them repeat across individuals, whether they worked in South America or South Asia or the Middle East. It took time for me to see it, but once I saw it, I was like, this is really real. And of course, being a photographer in many regards puts you on a front line because you have to be there with the camera in order to create the visual documentation. So you see lots of things, lots of terrible things in these spaces, lots of wonderful things too, but the terrible things can take a real toll. And so I kind of moved to doing some more work in this kind of safety advocacy space. And over the past many years, 20 years, I would say, there has been a growing awareness that safety in the journalism space is called hostile environments is very, very important. And initially, this was physical safety in war zones, right? Like if you're going to have journalists near soldiers, well, journalists shouldn't have weapons, but they should have all the tactical gear that protects a soldier. And that makes sense, right? Like you protect them. But even with a kind of growing awareness that, and I just mean this even in a cultural sense, right? Like in, let's say, American culture, like mental health matters. It's still been a bit slow in the journalism safety space. There are definitely organizations that have started doing work on this over the past years, but it's not as built into these trainings and workshops as physical safety. And then when I do work elsewhere around the globe, I've definitely been in cultures where like talking about mental health is really not part of the common parlance. So I have been doing work on this, and some of it is research where I kind of publish papers that look at aspects of mental health. And I'm trying to do it in a way that reaches a broad public and has impact. And so one of the things that I'm doing right now is co-leading it's actually the first ever nationwide study of mental health and journalism in a wartime setting. So it is all of Ukraine, where I was just like 2 weeks ago. And what that is doing is kind of it's a survey. It's a big survey that went out to all Ukrainian media workers who wanted to participate. We got a lot of respondents on that. And it's tracking all manner of kind of emotional consequences of working in a wartime setting. And as you might suspect, the emotional consequences are very high. The data hasn't been kind of finalized, but preliminary data is showing I want to say it's like 85% of journalists are reporting a traumatic episode on the job. Like that's an enormous percentage. About 10% are reporting thoughts of suicide. That's also an enormous percentage. You know, what I have to do with that is kind of put it all together and then translate it into what can newsrooms do? What can organizations in Ukraine, journalism organizations do? What can freelancers do? What can trainings do? And ideally, it won't just be responsive to the data, but actually preventative or at least mitigate some of the situations. And it's not just that they're in a war zone. There's a lot of like nuance specific to what's happening there. So one of the things that was very interesting to me, for instance, was so Ukraine has a conscription. So men of a certain, fighting age can be conscripted, which means that the broad media workforce is tipping more female right now because men are getting conscripted. But anyone who is going to work on the front lines as a journalist, you're basically reporting on a 95% male space. It's the military. And there's a lot of gender harassment that is happening. And it was having serious mental health fallout. But it was also quite specific to the dynamics of this country and this wartime. I'm very interested in kind of doing that kind of research and advocating for, how do you take a real-time psychological picture of a media workforce and then provide them the resources they need to work within their real-time space. Some of this will carry from one war zone to the next, and some of it will be really specific to Ukraine. in terms of the journalists who are thinking, or even photographers who are like, okay, if I avoid war zones, I'll never deal with any of this. Because a lot of my work and others' work is showing that sort of mental health tolls they're all over the place. And we know this just from the real world. But one of the things I think is pretty simple, and any photojournalist, whether freelancer or staff, can get into the habit, is like you go online, you go to one of these kind of watchdog journalism agencies. Many of them provide templates for a risk assessment, and you just add in a few questions about your own mental health. The risk assessments are often geared towards physical safety and getting in and getting out, and when you'll be checking in with an editor, things to keep you safe in very important ways, but they don't always fold in the mental health. And it's so easy to just ask a question of like, do I think this might be a really difficult assignment for me personally for any reason? Or do I think it might just be really difficult in general? And if the answer is yes, that doesn't mean don't take the assignment. But the next step might be, okay, so what do I do? Or who do I call? Or what are some quick coping strategies if I start to feel like really, really depressed because I'm covering this very sad story? And I think, I do think with time that this will become more standard practice to kind of fold this into a risk assessment. But I am a big advocate of doing risk assessments. And I do think that any journalist can just say to themselves, I'm just going to ask myself, before I go on this assignment, how am I doing? During this assignment, how am I doing? After this assignment, have I processed? Do I need to talk to someone? How am I doing?
Absolutely. No, I think that's really, really great recommendations. So hopefully that'll be useful to people also listening in to this podcast. You've got such like a wide breadth of work. And so I'm conscious that we can't cover it all and, touch on all of the projects you have going on at the minute. But is there anything that I should have asked but didn't?
I'm very glad that you asked the mental health stuff, in part because I literally just got back from Ukraine and it's something I'm doing more and more. I guess the one thing I would want to say is strange to say, but I do love that I have a specialty in conflict and crisis, and I continue to care about this very much as a topic. But I also wouldn't ever make the claim that photojournalism matters more than what might be happening locally in a photojournalist's community. I say that almost, I guess, from an advocacy position, as at least where I am based in the United States, like local journalism is really hurting here. And the smaller newsrooms and the smaller publications are dwindling. And I think actually community and local reporting is so vital to the health of a community that I personally, tend to do a lot of work in other countries or in outright war zones or really volatile spaces. But I would never say that the work happening in 5 hours upstate from me in New York isn't just as important.
I think that's a really great caveat. And just the final question that I ask everyone on the podcast is, what does photography ethics mean to you?
Photography ethics means thinking through all aspects of the photo. So the photojournalist, before they pick up the camera, when they're in front of whatever they're documenting, before they file the image to an editor, and then kind of seeing where the image goes. I also, I guess maybe in tandem with my mental health work, I think photo ethics should also be an industry that looks out for and protects its photojournalists in the same way that I want to require photojournalists to be as protective of subjects. I guess what I should say is I think they should operate in a way that should aim to reduce any harm to whatever story they're working on. And I also think the industry has the obligation to reduce any harm for its media workers too.
Thank you very much for listening to this episode of the Photo Ethics Podcast. The aim of this podcast is to share new insights about photography ethics with others. So if you heard something you liked, please share this podcast with someone who would appreciate it. You can also rate and review us on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. This episode of the Photo Ethics Podcast is sponsored by Falmouth University, one of the UK's leading creative arts universities. In a world where images shape narratives, ethical photography has never been more important. At Falmouth University, the online photography MA helps you master your craft while exploring the responsibilities of visual storytelling. Learn from industry experts, challenge conventions, and develop work with integrity, all from almost anywhere in the world. Join a global community of photographers committed to making a difference. Search Falmouth Online and book a call with a course advisor today. Join me next week when we hear from Jay Leonard on opportunity versus access.